Lifespan development. Today under this we are going to deal with the topic adolescent development theories. The objective of this lesson is to understand the developmental theories related to adolescence, to understand how cognitive development theory of adolescence takes place, to understand the moral development theory, and to understand the identity versus identity confusion in adolescence. The scientific approach for understanding the adolescence from different theoretical perspective or from different points of view. As a result of this, there are many theories for adolescent development. However, each theoretical perspective is based on a particular assumption to explain the adolescent development. No one single theoretical perspective covers all aspects of adolescence. By examining particular contribution from several theoretical perspectives, one may be able to arrive at a more comprehensive and well understanding of this adolescence. Let us now first consider the first theory of adolescence, that is the biological-maturational theory. Assuming that adolescence begins with biological changes accompanying the puberty, it is from this assumption the earlier views of adolescence assumed as a direct link between the biological factors and psychological development. This perspective was pioneered by G. Stanley Hall. Hall's theory is probably the earliest formal theory of adolescence. As such, he is called as the father of scientific study of adolescence. Influenced by the Darwin's evolutionary theory, Hall argued that each person's psychological development recapitulates both biological and cultural evaluation of human species. The notion that ontogeny means the individual development, is brief and rapid recapitulation of phylogeny, that is the evolutionary development of human race. In essence, ontogeny reflects the development of the childhood through adolescence to adulthood. On the other hand, phylogeny reflects the evolution of man from early man through a traditional primitive man to the modern man. Hall saw adolescence as a time of storm and stress. According to Hall, the adolescent period of storm and stress is full of contradictions and wide swings in mood and emotions. The thoughts, feelings, and actions oscillate between the humility and conceit, goodness and temptations, and from happiness to sadness. One moment the adolescent may be nasty to the pair, and the next moment he might be nice to her. At one time he wants to be left alone, but shortly after some time the desire to cling to somebody occurs. In sum, Stanley Hall views adolescence as a turbulent time charged with conflict, a perspective which he labels it as stress and storm view of adolescence. Hall's analysis of adolescence years also led him to believe that the time to begin strenuously educating such faculties as civility, scientific thinking, morality at the age of 15 years. However, Hall's developmental vision of education is rested mainly on highly speculative theory rather than the empirical data. It was he who began theorizing the systematic and questioning that went beyond mere speculation and philosophy. The concept of adolescence as a period of storm and stress, however, raises several questions. That is, firstly, the adolescence is particularly stressful or conspicuously more so than any other periods. The second question is, if it were to concede that adolescence is stressful, then how stressful is it? And the third question is such stress attributable because of the physical changes that occurs or because of the society's failures to adopt the adolescent needs? And finally, what special measures, if any, should be taken to prevent or alleviate such stress the adolescent is experiencing? So, this is about the Hall's theory of adolescence. Jessel advocates that adolescence as a period characterized by negativism, introversion, rebellion. Another important theorist, Anna Freud advocates that adolescence is typified by psychological disequilibrium resulting from sexual maturity and arousal of ego defense mechanism, that is the intellectualism. She also viewed adolescence as a state of flux, alternating between the periods of high enthusiasm and utter despair, between altruism and self-centeredness. Despite the significance that all views on the study of adolescence had, yet there are many other ideas not stood to test time, and all the writers do not agree that adolescence as a period of storm and stress. The social learning theory consists of rather diverse thoughts that range from Hull's drive reduction theory to Skinner's reinforcement theory to Freud's psychoanalytical theory. Social learning theory's effort in combining such a diverse point of view and has been described as merging of the clinically rich psychoanalytical concepts with scientifically rigorous behavior constructs. Clearly, social learning theory is a multidimensional, that it draws the concepts, hypotheses and methodology from variety of different psychological sources. While the social learning theory develops its own theoretical constructs, of which modeling and observing are most important, it draws freely on the constructs of behavior learning theory also. Skinner's concept of direct reinforcement is expanded to include the important social dimensions. Thus, the concerns of the social learning theory is those of the narrow connections between a stimulus and response. The bidirectional of the social influences, especially that of the children themselves being the active contributors to their own development, has undergone an influence of this social learning theory and became a core concept in ecological and contextual theories of development. Apart from incorporating the important models, the role of cognitive process, imitation of the models in the learning process, and adding the relationship of the individuals and social groups and the mutual influences are of unique importance in these theories. In short, the social learning theory is the whole spectrum of socialization process. These encompasses the imitation, modeling, instruction, reward and punishment by which the children learn and to which the children contribute, often through indirect teaching. The significance of socializing agents as a source of pattern of behavior has often been neglected in other theories. Even though observational and empirical evidences indicate that this aspect of learning process is fundamental to socialization and personality development. Bandura, a leading social learning theorist, has pioneered the view that cognition, that is the act of knowing, bearing and environment, they play a primary role in human behavior. Bandura has observed that much of the adolescent behavior comes from observational learning, in which the adolescent observes and imitates the behavior of their parents, the other adults and peers. Furthermore, the adolescent learning and behavior are significantly affected by the cognitive variables such as competences, encoding strategies, expectances, personal values, self-regulatory systems, that is self-monitoring and motivation. Piaget's cognitive development theory and information processing are the two main cognitive theories. Piaget defines adolescence as a stage of transition from the use of concrete operations to the applications of formal operations in reasoning. This clearly distinguishes it from the puberty, which is the period in adolescence which is characterized by the physiological changes that end in childhood and bring the young person to adolescent size, shape and potential. Robert Havikhurst combines the individual's readiness for learning with certain social demands, defining the 8 developmental tasks of the adolescence. This is about the environmental theories. Pioneered by Sigmund Freud, the founder of psychoanalysis, he regards childhood as the most formative period of the human development. In other words, he believed that the dynamics of personality depends largely on how the sexual instinct, that is the id, ego and superego, have been shaped during the formative years of the childhood. In the three-dimensional model of the mind, the id is a biological and is subconscious part of the mind, which is not aware, but which can influence one's behavior as a part of the personality, or in other words, it upholds or represents the pleasure principle. It contains the irrational appetites and impulses. It emphasizes on the immediate gratification of needs, for example, hunger. Ego is a psychosocial, is a reality principle trying to endeavor to control the id to reality. The functions to adapt to the individual to reality, it delays, inhibits, restrains the control of its demands. The superego, which is social in nature, is the home of norms and ethical values of society, and it tries to bridge the gap between the id and ego. It represents the social moral component in the personality and represents the ideals rather than the real strive for perfection. The superego has two components, the consciousness and the ego ideal. The consciousness reacts to the moral transgression by the individuals through the feeling of guilt. The ego ideal produces pride and satisfaction if the individual's behavior is conforming to the acceptable standards. It is hypothesized that the weakening of the ego as a result of it and the subsequent inability of the superego to bridge the gap between the id and ego often has been cited as the major cause of psychological instability. The Freud's theoretical perspective emphasized that intensified sex drive resulting conflicts arouse a lot of anxiety in adolescence. This anxiety in turn produces a variety of defense mechanisms such as the repression, intellectualization, asceticism for coping with the stress in adolescence. Central to Freud's psychoanalytical theory is the assumption that human beings have a powerful drive that must be satisfied. As a biological creatures, there is a drive in the individuals to satisfy or serve their motives. Yet, the society dictates that many of these urges are undesirable. Freud further added that the people are unaware of their biological instincts and the driving forces behind these behaviors. According to Piaget, around 11 years of the young age, people or the children enter this formal operational stage, in which they develop the capacity for abstract scientific thinking, whereas the concrete operational children can operate on reality, the formal operational adolescents can operate on abstract things. In other words, they no longer require the concrete things or events as objects of thought. Instead, they can come up with a new, more general logical rules through internal reflections. We can see two types of stages in formal operational stage. Hypothetic-deductive reasoning. At adolescence, the young people first become capable of hypothetic-deductive reasoning. When faced with a problem, they start with a general theory of all possible factors that might affect the outcome and deduce from specific hypotheses about what might have happened. Then they test this hypothesis in an orderly fashion to see which one works in the real world. We can see a problem solving beginning with possibility and proceeds to reality. In contrast to the concrete operational children, they start with reality with the most obvious prediction about the situation. When these are not confirmed, they cannot think of other alternatives and fail to solve the problem. In contrast, a concrete operational child experiment unsystematically. They cannot separate the effects of each variable. They may test the effect of the string length without holding the weight constant and comparing. For example, a short light pendulum with a long heavy one. Also, a school child failed to notice that a variable that are not immediately suggested by the concrete material of the task, that is the height and the force at which the object can be released. So, this is the difference between a formal operational thought child and a concrete operational thought child. The next one is the propositional thought. Adolescents can evaluate the logic of the propositions without referring to the real world circumstances. In contrast, the children can evaluate the logical statements only by considering them at a concrete evidence in the real world. Adolescents' emotionality can be attributed mainly to the fact that the boys and girls come under social pressure and face new conditions for which they received little if any preparation during their childhood. Not all the adolescents by any means go through a period of the stress and storm. True, most of them do experience the emotional instability from time to time, which is logical consequences of necessity of making adjustments to new patterns of behavior and new social expectations. So, adolescents' emotions are often intense, uncontrolled, seemingly irrational, and there is generally an improvement in emotional behavior with each passing year. To achieve the emotional maturity, adolescents must learn to get a perspective on situations which otherwise would lead to emotional reactions. They can do the best is by discussing their problems with others. Their willingness to disclose their attitudes, feelings and personal problems is influenced partly by how secure they are feeling in the social relationships and partly how much they like the target person. In addition, if adolescents are to achieve the emotional maturity, they must learn to use the emotional catharsis to clear the system of pent-up emotions. This they can do by strenuous physical exercise in play or work, or by laughing or by crying. While all of these provide an outlet for pent-up emotions, energy that accompanies control over the emotional expressions, the social attitudes towards crying are unfavorable as they are towards the laughing, unless laughter is held in check and occurs only in the social group approvals. So, after having understood about the emotional maturity and emotional changes in adolescence, let us see what are the social changes during the adolescence. The most difficult developmental task of adolescence relates to the social adjustments. These adjustments must be made to members of the other sex in relationship than they never existed before and to the adults outside the family and school environment. To achieve this goal of adult pattern of socialization, the adolescent must make new adjustments. The most important and in many respects the most difficult of this is the increased influence of peer group, changes in social behavior and new social groupings, new values in friendship selections and social acceptance and rejection. Increased peer group influences. Because the adolescent is spending most of their time outside the home, the peer group influence is more in adolescence. Changes in social behavior. Of all the changes that takes place in social attitudes and behavior, the most pronounced is in the area of the heterosexual relationship. In short period of time, the adolescents make a radical shift from disliking the members of opposite sex to preferring the companionship of the members of their own sex. Social activities with either of the member of the same gender usually reach the peak during these adolescent years. So, this is about the social changes that takes place during the adolescence. In these changes taking place in social development of the adolescence, we see new social groupings. The gangs of the childhood gradually break up at puberty and during the early adolescence as the individual's interests shift from the strenuous play activities of the child to less strenuous and more formal social activities, new social group forming occurs. This can be the close friends. The adolescents usually have 2 or 3 close friends and confidants, and the children have a marked influence on one another. The next new social grouping during the adolescence is the cliques. Cliques are usually made up of group of close friends. At first they consist of members of the same sex, but later they may include from both boys and girls. The individual's moral outlook becomes more progressively abstract and less concrete. The moral convicts become more concerned with what is right and less concerned with what is wrong. According to Kohlberg, the third development stage of moral development, that is post-conventional morality, should be reached when the child is in a stage of adolescence. This is a level of self-accepted principles, and it consists of 2 stages. In the first stage, the individual believes that there should be flexibility in moral beliefs to make it possible to modify and change the moral standards, if this will be advantageous to the group members as a whole. In the second stage, the individual conforms to both social standards and internalized ideals to avoid self-condemnation rather than avoid the social censure. In this stage, the morality is based on respect for others rather than the personal desires. Even the best foundation, the 3 major tasks in achieving this morality is the specific concepts with general moral concepts formulating into the newly developed concepts or assuming control over their own behavior, difficult for many adolescents, and some fail to make the shift to adult morality during adolescence and must finish this task in early adulthood. Others not only fail to make this shift, but they build a moral code on socially unacceptable moral concepts. So, this is about the moral development during the adolescent periods. Another important theory which is needed to understand the adolescent development is the Erikson's identity versus confusion. Erikson was the first one to recognize identity as a major personality achievement of adolescence and a crucial step towards becoming a productive, happy adult. Constructing an identity involves defining who you are, what you value, and directions you choose to pursue in life. One expert describes it as an explicit theory of oneself as a rational agent, one who acts on the basis of reason and takes a responsibility for those actions and can explain them. This search for what is true and real about the self is the driving force behind many new commitments to sexual orientation, to taking up a vocation, to interpersonal relationships and community involvement, ethnic group membership, the moral, political and religious cultural ideals. Erikson calls this psychological conflict of adolescence as identity versus identity confusion. Successful outcome of the earlier stages paves way to a positive resolution. The young people who reach adolescence with a weak sense of trust, having trouble finding ideals to have a faith in, and those with little autonomy or initiative do not engage in the activities of exploration, requiring to choose among the alternatives, and those who lack the industry fail to select a vocation that matches their interest and skills. Although the seeds of identity formation are planted earlier, not until the adolescence do the young people become absorbed in this task. According to Erikson, in complex societies, teenagers experience an identity crisis. It is a temporary period of confusion and distress as they experiment with alternatives before setting on values and goals. Adolescents who go through the process of inner soul searching eventually arrive at a mature identity. They shift through the characteristics that define the self in childhood and combine them with the new commitments. The current theories agree with the Erikson that the question of values, plans and priorities is necessary for a mature identity. But they no longer refer to this process as a crisis. Exploration better describes the typical adolescent's gradual uneventful approach to identity formation. Erikson describes the negative outcome of adolescence as identity confusion. So, this is about the Erikson's theory of identity and identity confusion. So, today we have learned about the theories which are influencing the adolescent development. We have understood the Stanley Hall's theory, biological-maturational theory. We have understood Anna Freud's psychoanalytical theory, and we have understood the Piaget's cognitive development theory, where the adolescent is moving to the formal operational thought. And we also have understood how the Kohlberg's moral developmental theory, in which the adolescent will be in the stage of the post-conventional moral development. And we have seen how the crisis, identity versus confusion, occurs and leads to crisis in the adolescent age or period of development. Hope you have understood the lesson. Thank you.